Hello, my name is Christine Kray. The title of my presentation is Archival Violence and the Official Erasure of Indigenous Heritage in Northern Belize. This map represents the Yucatecan Peninsula in the 19th century, including the fledgling colony of British Honduras in the southeast. To set the stage, I begin with one episode. In 1962, as British colonies around the world were clamoring for independence, as part of Operation Legacy, officers in British Honduras, now Belize, aimed to remove and destroy any government documents that might prove embarrassing to the Crown and Empire. An MI5 officer coordinated the effort, in which he, quote, was assisted by the Royal Navy and several gallons of petrol, end quote, according to a Foreign Office record. Why does this matter? What are the consequences of acts of official erasure? Several, as you might imagine, but to tie this into the theme of the conference, heritage, official acts of erasure in British Honduras helped establish a narrative that northern Belize was essentially vacant, a terra nullius at the time of British occupation, and that Maya people living in northern Belize are descendants of immigrants from other countries and therefore not deserving of indigenous land claims. This depiction of the Maya as outsiders is reinforced in the present. For example, as the Belize Tourism Board characterizes two ethnic groups. One, the Maya, are depicted as the modern-day descendants of the ancient Maya civilization, whose cultural heritage is of interest only insofar as it remains unchanged from the pre-Hispanic past. A second group, identified in northern Belize, are called mestizos, meaning mixed, and they are characterized as a cultural blend of Maya and Spanish, unrelated somehow to British colonization. Stated differently, a person of Maya ancestry can either be a modern-day bearer of a 1,000-year-old Maya culture or else an outsider Spanish hybrid. There is no place within this cultural typology for modern Maya people whose ancestors were indigenous to the Belize region and whose cultural ways have evolved over time and in relation to British colonists and the Creole descendants of enslaved Africans. This cultural typology negatively affects the ability of northern Belize Maya to be fairly represented within the museum and tourism worlds in Belize, and it also cripples any claims to lands as indigenous people. How did this characterization of northern Maya people as outsider immigrants develop? We must consider the violence of the colonial archive more broadly. If indigenous groups in the present are to be successful in being recognized as legitimate elements of nation states, they must rely upon archival records. How can they do so, however, if the creation and compilation of such documents were designed to facilitate colonial rule in the first place? Essentially, how can a colonial archive aid in the decolonization process? Audre Lorde wrote, quote, "The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," an insight which Linda Toohey Weiss-Smith quotes in her book on decolonizing methodologies. Colonial archives, after all, are simply the documents of colonial government. They represent records about the process of occupation, claims of dominion, and practices of ordering and extraction. In his Annals of the Archives piece, Nicholas Dirks addressed this issue, reflecting upon how, although he began his work in the colonial archives in India to learn something about pre-colonial political formations, it was nearly impossible to do so. The records are legion, labyrinthine, and overwhelmingly about land tenure, transfer, and taxation. They reflect, in other words, British goals of capital accumulation via taxation. Archival records, like all utterances, cannot be understood apart from the context of their authorship and compilation. They privilege the written word and colonial authorship, authority, visions, and projects. They were, in the main, documents written by and for colonialists, and they presuppose shared understandings and values. Additionally, archives reflect patterns of secrecy, who had the authority to read certain documents and when. There are varying levels of classification in which certain documents could only be accessed by a select few. Those classified as secret would remain as such for 75 years, and others would never see the light of day. I mentioned the torching of British Honduran records in 1962. As Ian Cobain explained, however, this incident was just one example from Operation Legacy, which began with the partition of India in 1947 and went into effect across the empire. Fearing international embarrassment and potential legal repercussions if newly independent people were to gain access to certain colonial records, Operation Legacy called for sensitive records to be culled and either destroyed on site, crated up and dumped into the ocean, or else transferred to a top-secret compound in Hanslope, north of London. As Cobain discussed, however, Occupation Legacy itself was simply the most dramatic episode in a long history of self-serving records curation that protected the reputation of the Crown and Empire. My research shows that in the case of British Honduras, records that would help establish pre-British Maya presence in northern Belize were systematically buried even prior to Operation Legacy. As I mentioned, in the case of Belize, Indigenous people confront a myth of terra nullius, or the notion that prior to British occupation, the land was vacant and therefore free for the taking. In official histories that spanned a century, Indigenous inhabitants were configured only as immigrants from Mexico or Guatemala, who would therefore have no legal claim to land as Aboriginal inhabitants. This terra nullius fiction was established in the Handbook of British Honduras in 1888-89, a sort of summary orientation manual about the colony for newly arrived public servants. In the section on historical summary, which runs for 7 pages, there's not a single mention of Indigenous inhabitants until 1857, when a group called the Chichanha, quote, invaded the British-claimed region as refugees from the Yucatecan Social War to the north, more commonly known as the Caste War. Otherwise, in this official history, the British occupation and settlement is situated within the context of Anglo-Spanish imperial competition in Central America, and enslaved Africans were introduced, it is said, due to the absence of native labor. The terra nullius myth gathered steam in another set of official records, a series of books called the Archives of British Honduras. This 3-volume, 1,100-page set provides an overview of documents housed within the Colonial Office, then in Belize City, subsequently in Belmopan. This work was created by a team led by the colonial governor, Sir John Alder Burden. The work is not comprehensive as it does not index all documents compiled. What is curious is both what is summarized and what is conspicuously absent. Today, the work is used as the starting point for historical researchers who will select records to be examined based upon what is listed in the work and how those documents are characterized. Researchers cannot request to see documents that they do not know exist, nor will they ask to see certain documents if the telegraphic descriptions of those documents do not mention the topic of interest to the researcher. The work's introduction, what is called the historical note, penned by Governor Burden himself, reiterates the terra nullius fiction. The British occupation is described within the context of Anglo-Spanish competition only, and Burden states, quote, there is no record of any indigenous Indian population and no reason to believe that any such existed except far in the interior. There are traces of extensive Maya Indian occupation, temples, wells, foundations, cultivation terraces, all over the colony, but this occupation was long before British settlement. The almost complete disappearance of the once teeming Maya population from these regions is one of the problems of Maya archaeology, end quote. This official myth was reprinted in colonial annual reports for several decades. The vacant territory myth bore direct consequences. In the 1890s, when the colony was beginning to consider a policy of land reserves, the notion of reserves for Indigenous people who were officially characterized as immigrants was rejected out of hand. In 1912, Acting Governor Wilfrid Collett concluded that no Indigenous people in British Honduras could make viable land claims, stating, quote, "The only Aboriginal natives of America in the colony are either immigrants or the descendants of persons who came to the colony after it became a British possession. No natives seem to have been dispossessed," end quote. However, in bits and pieces, existing documents provide evidence of Indigenous occupation in the Belize region in the 17th and 18th centuries, contradicting the official British narrative. Many of those details, however, come not from sources housed in the British archives, but accounts published elsewhere as travelers' and soldiers' accounts, and from archives in Mexico, Guatemala, and Spain. These accounts established that there were small settlements, often located at a distance from the major waterways, where British loggers and their enslaved African workers were cutting logwood and mahogany timber. It is not surprising that Indigenous settlements were not found along the swampy, mosquito-ridden coastline and along the major rivers at that time, as any such settlements would previously have been decimated by mosquito-borne Old World diseases introduced by the Spanish even prior to British occupation. Additionally, the earliest European invaders had raided Indigenous villages and taken people into slavery, and therefore it stands to reason that the Indigenous people subsequently would have steered clear of the woodcutters. Throughout the 3 centuries of Spanish colonialism, however, the Belize region was a refuge zone for Maya people from the northern part of the Yucatecan Peninsula, fleeing colonial Spanish depredations, and they developed deliberate strategies of hiding their settlements. In fact, in the sections of Burden's work related to the late 18th and early 19th centuries, one finds several references to, quote, Indian raids on the logging works, thereby contradicting Burden's own summary. Moreover, there is evidence that certain government documents that would have been embarrassing for the British and would have weakened British claims on the land were intentionally buried. First, a critical 1786 Anglo-Spanish treaty included several provisions permitting the British to cut timber within a certain portion of the lands otherwise claimed as Spain's dominion. Among the treaty's stipulations, Article 14 indicated that the British were prohibited from providing weaponry to the Indians. This stipulation took on heightened significance during the Social War, when British merchants became the primary suppliers of guns and gunpowder to the Maya rebels, thereby indirectly causing the loss of life of tens of thousands of Yucatecans. British munitions sales, in fact, were a sticking point in the border dispute between Mexico and British Honduras, which remained unresolved until the end of the war in 1901. In Burden's official work, the 1786 treaty is reprinted, but only up to Article 8. Reprinting Article 14 would have highlighted British breaches of land treaty agreements, and it was conveniently left out by Burden's team. In a second example, during the Social War, peace negotiations between the Yucatecan government and a subset of the rebels were in fact hosted in Belize City in 1853, with the British superintendent serving as mediator. The negotiations resulted in a treaty in which the surrendering rebels would be granted autonomy within a certain region. The region indicated on this map in the northwest. This region, with valuable timber stands, however, was already central to British timber extraction efforts. In Burden's index for the year 1853, the only entry that mentions the treaty is a summary of a letter from the British superintendent to the, quote, Indian commissioners, letting them know that the Mexican government probably would not recognize the treaty. The treaty was, in fact, observed by the Yucatecan state government and the pacified rebels for decades and ultimately led to Maya-British armed conflict. But one would not know anything about the treaty by using Burden's work as a guide. Don Dumond, the preeminent historian of the war, indicated that he could not find a copy of the treaty in the colonial archives in Belize, and in fact only stumbled across a copy of it included as an enclosure within another document in the colonial archives in London. The third example I want to share with you concerns a report, quote, destroyed by statute. In 1936, the entire Maya village of San Jose was evicted by the London-based Belize Estate and Produce Company, specializing in mahogany, sugar, and chicle. With the assistance of the colonial government, and the people were displaced onto a reservation. This eviction is not mentioned in the annual colonial report, and the official report about the eviction was destroyed, as you can see in this photograph from the Index of Colonial British Honduran Records in the Colonial Office Archives in the UK. You can see the stamp reading destroyed under statute in the top right corner. I went through the entire index of colonial British Honduran records page by page for the period 1900 to 1940, and there were only about 5 records marked destroyed by statute, including this one. Why was this document destroyed? I had previously conducted interviews with 14 elderly people who had lived through the eviction when they were still children. When they were evicted, they were allowed to take only what they could carry. Their houses and fields in San Jose were burned so that they would not be tempted to return, and their domestic animals were left to starve. The people were loaded onto the railway cart that otherwise moved timber, transferred to a barge, and shipped upriver, and temporarily housed in army barracks until they could build houses on their new reserve. The villagers suffered an immediate health crisis, and many children and elderly people died. The reason why the report is destroyed is not hard to imagine. Maya people in northern Belize seeking to establish legitimacy as an indigenous group in Belize cannot rely upon the British archives alone, whether those in Belmopan or in the UK, but need to rely additionally upon other rare documents published elsewhere or archived in Mexico, Guatemala, and Spain. Archaeologists have an important role to play here as well. They can provide a great public service by helping to document indigenous presence in the region in the 17th and 18th centuries, which the British otherwise claimed as their own. The evidence of British malfeasance concerning the documentary record calls for additional research that might contradict the vacant land myth that has already perpetrated so much violence. Thank you very much for your time.